I already took my jacket off, so if you feel more comfortable without it, please feel free. It is pretty warm. Nice day. Very interesting presentation by Christian Lelong. And if I had to summarize it, it sounded pretty good for the shipping industry. I don't know if that's a fair summary, but it seems like if these various options are to play out, there's going to be a lot of products and crudes going around the world. Is that a fair conclusion?
Yeah, I think that's likely. And again, it's there's not necessarily a lot of transparency as to what's happening right now and what may happen, but we think there's likely to be a big part of the solution is the refiners just optimizing for sulfur, which is something they haven't had to do much in the past.
How do you see that, Paddy? Do you think that's an opportunity?
I'm not sure whether it's an opportunity for us. I think it's an opportunity for the refiners. I mean, what's happening is that you're getting a significant price put on sulfur. So as soon as there's which will be expressed as a discount in anything that's sulfur rich. So all of a sudden there's an incentive for anybody. I mean, so you completely reorder the movement of crude in order to drive sulfur towards the people who can deal with it. And the ones who can deal with it will get cheaper feedstock and they'll make greater margin on their refining process. So the market should fundamentally drive the arb on sulfur consumption.
Okay. Another note that I took from Kristen's presentation was the idea that there should be incentive for scrubber manufacturers to increase their capacity for the pickup that I've seen in the scrubber installations. Aaron, do you see it in that way? Do you think there will be more capacity for installations, and how long is that going to live, the life of the scrubbers?
Well, I think it was an interesting perspective in the one slide that showed the scrubbing versus the gas and the distillates. As you could see, that over several years, it looked like things were tailing off a bit. So from, I think, a manufacturing perspective, we see that there's probably a limited life of really high demand, and then you'll get to a point of steady state. So from a manufacturer's perspective, we would be investing now to deal with the, let's say, the leading edge of the wave, but then over time we would most likely have to get down to a lower operating capacity anyway. So it would be good to have an incentive to invest now in the engineering resources, in the supply chain development, in order to deal with that leading edge of the wave. But then obviously we would need to get to a point where we could have our costs covered in a economic way for the future.
And Robert, do you see that there might be that the regulatory pressures would change this path for scrubbers? I'm talking about the wash water or compatibility with Tier 3.
Well, actually not. I mean, I think we have had a kind of a rather blunt view to the whole thing all the time, and IMO have in place discharge water criteria, and I mean, the majority of the oil to be scrubbed will happen in the open sea anyway, where you only have the IMO wash water criteria. Scrubbers are not explicitly permitted under MARPOL. It's an option you can use because it's an equivalent option. And that is not going to go away. So what could happen potentially over time is, of course, a strengthening of the discharge water criteria. But again, to a degree where it would really impact on operating scrubbers, I don't see that at all. But I did notice from the slides, especially the last one, where you had all the different projections on fuel types, that basically by 2020 1/3 would be gas oil, 1/3 would be low sulfur fuel oil, a little bit of scrubbing, and then basically 1/3 almost of non-compliant fuel. That's quite concerning, I think, when you look at it. And I just wonder how that would play in when you after 2 months get a ban on carriage of non-compliant fuels. for ships without scrubbers. So I think there is maybe some misconceptions in establishing what will happen, and I think we need to be sure that we understand what compliance means by 2020 and how we deal with it.
Wolfgang, how do your membership perceive this? How do they see, what are their concerns, and how do they see the impact on their business?
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, first of all, for inviting me here to represent the views of the German ship owners. We are still having 2,500 ships under management, and what we could see up to now, that the vast majority will go for the low sulfur fuel 0.5. I think we always try to explain the big difference of maybe the world shipping compared to the German shipping market, because we have 90% of our tonnage is being chartered out. So 90% of our ship owners don't buy the fuel, but they have to comply with the fuel they're getting. And for sure we could see that there is already some rush for some owners looking into retrofitting their vessels either with scrubber or also on LNG, which is where we have a subsidy program, luckily in Germany, to support these costs for the German ship owners. And but it depends finally on the charterer's choice. But from the discussions there and also from the international exchange, we could see that I think at the end, I expect somewhere 70 to 80% worldwide will go on 0.5 sulfur fuel. There will be some scrubbers. In Germany we have currently, if you count in the Carnival cruise ships from AIDA and others, we have about 50 ships fitted with scrubbers, which is just a small number for the whole fleet. And increasingly there are some new build and retrofit orders on LNG, but as I said, the vast majority is going there. But we are also seeing for sure now the big problems coming up for the Trump shipping, especially for the bulkers. And there especially our big member Egon Ollendorf in Lübeck has to look now on this huge challenge to get this fuel, and they now have started with a bigger retrofit program for scrubbers.
Paddy, how do you see?
Well, I probably wanted more to ask a question than to comment on it, because we talk about scrubbers and yet there's at least two types, I suppose. But I mean, the popularity or the surge in ordering in the recent 6 months has been on what was called an open loop scrubber. So scrubbing technology has been around for power industry and for lots of other industries for some time.
Right.
Yeah, is there, and I'm asking, I don't know, is there any precedent for the use of a scrubber which then returns the waste materials from scrubbing to the environment? Is there any other industry where, because I suppose in the power industry they capture or they use some sort of closed loop system. I'm not familiar with it. But.
Christian, do you have a view on that?
Yeah, no, it's there's no equivalent to my knowledge of open loop in the power sector. The sulfur is captured. It will be deposited at the bottom of a flue gas desulfurization unit in solid form, and then it's trucked away. To be honest, I don't know what happens after that, but I would imagine there are factories that make some use of that sulfur, and sulfur can then be sold to the chemical industry. But I don't think there is an equivalent to open loop in power.
So that's not really a big opportunity for shipping to start selling sulfur.
Well, I think the question is that so far shipping in its legislative bodies have looked at open loop scrubbers, but has that been really looked at by the public at large, and how the world opinion feels about it?
Probably not. Lars, Robert, or Aaron, have you seen discussion on that at large?
Well, obviously there is a potential discussion in the wider, in the wider society beyond IMO. But on the other hand, IMO is representing the the governments of the world, and one would expect that whatever comes out of IMO in terms of a wastewater criteria is actually acceptable to those countries. I mean, else I would expect them not to approve it. We have a wastewater criteria from IMO. Yes, it can be changed over time. I don't think it will be changed to a degree where it will basically outlaw open loop scrubbers. I think also from a sulfur perspective, that does not make any sense. I mean, there is a whole lot of sulfur in the ocean anyway, and whatever we could add from this industry is so marginal you couldn't even measure it. So it's not the sulfur issue per se. There could be other issues, but that's why we have a discharge criteria to deal with whatever else could be in the effluent water from the scrubbers.
So we've been talking about scrubbers, and when we talk about 2020, it's impossible not to bring up the issue of fuel quality, particularly since we've just recently had some cases of quality issues on the fuel that has nothing to do with 2020. However, some people perceive that this could be indicative of what we could expect after 2020 with the fuels. And I do not want to necessarily spend time today on talking about what were the quality issues with the fuels, but maybe we could spend a little bit of time thinking what solutions we could look for. What could we change in our industry, especially on the fuel supply side, that would eliminate or at least minimize these issues that we're dealing with? Anybody like to? Okay.
Yeah, thanks. From our point of view, as we are also part of, for sure, the IMO work discussions, and we have a special ARA group for Amsterdam, Rotterdam, and Antwerp to come up with the other ship owners communities and ISO and so others to look on the microcosmos of bunker supply, fuel quality, and so on. And I think it's quite interesting to have this exchange of views, especially with the bunker suppliers and also the refineries. What we are missing, to be honest, since years on this worldwide 2020 perspective, to get some more input, proactive input from the refineries, to get knowledge about the fuel we will get in 2020 or even sometimes earlier. And what we are always looking at are the experiences from the 0.1 ultra low sulfur heavy fuel oils, where we have these big varieties and problems with incompatibility and other points. And therefore, I think it's quite important that we get knowledge about the various processes from the refinery to the ship at the end, and how the fuel will be delivered, and is it compatible. We heard from some suppliers recently that they even don't know yet if the fuel they will supply in Rotterdam will be compatible with the fuel supplied in Shanghai, which is a mess for the ship owner, because we have to mix it in between. And I think these are the specific challenges we definitely have to solve better yesterday than tomorrow with the refiners and the industry.
Lars, Robert?
Yeah, fuel quality. I think, I mean, for a start, I think what we could ask for in the shipping industry is that the countries of the world, the parties to MARPOL Annex 6, they actually do what they set forth to do when they adopted the revised regulations back in 2000, and I think it was 9 it was adopted. So I mean, it's almost 10 years ago. There is a provision that requires governments to take actions when they discover fuel is being delivered in their territory, where basically what's on the delivery note does not correspond to what was actually delivered on board. It's not some, hugely, cumbersome thing for governments to do, but at least it would make it, not penalty-free to deliver fuel oil that is unfit for use on board ships. That would be a starting point, and I think a good starting point, and one that we could basically solve a lot of the issues with. But that being said, come to 2020, 0.5% compliant fuel. If it turns out to be gas oil, as was put on this slide, to some extent, I don't think we have any big issues per se on the quality side. But certainly on the blended fuel side, the more you blend, the more problems we're likely to see. I think from a pure statistical perspective, we are bound to see a lot more cases of fuel quality issues with these type of fuels. Not really related to what we see now. This is just, an example of what can happen when we have quality issues in the shipping industry. But just from a statistical perspective, we saw it when the Tikka fuel limit was dropped from 1.5 to 1.0. We saw a lot more issues with quality of the 1.0% fuel, and now we're going to blend it even further down to 0.5. Yeah, I think we are bound to see quality issues.
Yes, please, Paddy.
And I think there's I think there are a couple of different points there, because I think we will have issues around it, but I think we'll also have issues around HFO, because obviously we've just had some problems with HFO. But if you keep shrinking the HFO pool, and it keeps getting stuff dumped into it in the same way that it gets dumped into it today, and you have a shrinking pool and the same amount of waste being put in, you're going to end up with an extremely unreliable HFO pool. Yeah. And in addition to that, of course, in the HFO pool today, with an average sulfur content of 2.5%, there are a lot of oils which are very low in sulfur. All of those will be pulled out, because they'll be pulled out to blend up into compliant fuel. So what you will get is your HFO pool will get closer and closer to the 3.5% limit, if not over it, and it'll have more and more dumped waste in it. So I think that there's going to be an issue around quality assurance of fuels, and whether it's compliant fuel or whether it's HFO, that's going to be a headache for all ship owners.
So do you think that just by the Marble member states, by taking some level of quality action on the fuels, that can be resolved? And why hasn't it happened before? Why would it be a solution today?
Well, why hasn't it happened before? Probably because governments have not been compelled to implement that piece of the regulation, and basically left it to the shipping industry to deal with it. But I think we should require that governments live up to the word of the law. It is very clearly written in 18.9, what they're supposed to do, and I don't think it's unreasonable to ask that. So it's just a good opportunity now to reinforce the requirement that has been around for 10 years. But I think also, Paddy, in response to what you just said, I think a lot of the quality problems does not really come from the heavy stuff that forms the base part of the residual fuels. The problems usually come in with the blend stocks, with the cutter stocks. We saw that with the we think that's what we're seeing now, at least with the heavy fuel oil, that somebody has been blending stuff into the fuel oil to adjust the viscosity or density or whatever. So it's usually coming in with the stuff you use to blend down the fuel, not so much from the actual, heavy pool itself. Obviously, there is a risk that with a reduced heavy fuel oil pool, that some would seek to optimize their waste management by dumping stuff into it.
Dumping cleaning agents, etc.
And obviously that's why we need the governments to step up when we see these problems, to actually take actions against the suppliers to prevent this from happening.
I think, Kirsi, that it may well be the government should intervene, but I don't think we have any leverage, and I don't think that will happen. What I think that may well happen is that fuel oil is going to become more expensive for shipping, full stop. And as it becomes more expensive, I think it may be an area that you could see that refiners are ready to move back into, and that we might get better quality assurance through the fact that this simply is an area where there are greater margins, or where there's more vulnerability to margin.
Right.
So at that point, it's very, very important to the economics of the refinery exactly what price everything's being sold at, and there's a lot more money to be made here than there used to be. So we might find them coming back in, and when they come back in, then we might get some quality assurance.
So the quality compatibility issue is also related to the availability issue and the uncertainty that Kristen was talking about, particularly right after 2020 or end of 2019. And so I'd like to maybe discuss a little bit of availability, not only availability of the low sulfur fuels, but also the availability of the high sulfur fuels that there's still small percentage of ships with scrubbers are going to demand. Do you all believe that there is going to be availability and the distribution is what the industry needs? And how is this going to impact the pricing of the two types of fuels? Who would like to take that? Wolfgang.
I would like to refer to the informations we have gathered during the last 12 months or so with big fuel oil suppliers, and all of them said what they expect, as we have seen earlier, that the majority of the existing heavy fuel oil will go to power plants because China was stepping out of the coal, and the additional opinion was that they expect that the sulfur level of these heavy fuel oil in the future might increase even up to 5%, which might cause some problems on the existing scrubbers, but we don't know. But what we know for sure is the big purchasing organizations from the big shipping liners or also big ship owners, as I named Egon Ollendorf, for example, who is now going into the scrubber business for retrofit. They definitely will go for their own supply deals with the refineries and the fuel suppliers to get still the high sulfur fuel on a for sure quite low price level. Where it will be, nobody knows about that. What we are expecting, as I said before, that the fuel price in total for 0.5 and gas oil and 0.1 ultra low sulfur heavy fuel oil will increase dramatically, because these blends will use just gas oil and heavy fuel oil for the 0.5, and that's for sure that the oil industry or the refineries will just get out a lot of money out of it, which might increase the number of scrubber installations, but I think this is more or less the glass bowl we are not in yet.
Anybody else?
Yeah, I don't think it's a huge problem if a ship with a scrubber experiences non-availability of heavy, high sulfur fuel oil in a port. I mean, you can always buy some compliant fuel. I mean, it's cheap, it's more expensive, yes, but I mean, it's not a huge problem per se. You could even tap into the pool of non-compliant compliant fuel in terms of sulfur, just above. The other thing is, with a scrubber, you're basically exempt from the provisions of the ban on carriage of high sulfur fuel. So from an operational point of view, there are actually quite some ease of operation if you have a scrubber, even if you after a while would not be able to source the right fuel, or maybe if you could not always source the right fuel. It is much easier from a compliance perspective, simply because you don't need to care.
So,
Well,
but,
hang on.
okay, sorry.
No, that can't
Go.
be right. Because you're not. This isn't a type approval. This isn't a license to burn heavy fuel oil. You're obliged to monitor and ensure that your emissions are maintained on 3 or 4 different parameters at all times, and to keep a record. And a failure to keep a record is also itself a non-compliance. I think we're heading towards a territory that, to my mind, looks a lot more like the oily water separator book, where a lot of people running scrubbers may find they get detained in port, and they could get detained in port because actually the computer recording of measurements failed during the voyage, not the actual scrubber functioning, and then they find themselves being banged with a penalty regardless of what the actual emissions were. So that looks much more like the American oily water record book problem. And so the idea that this is a ticket to ride is a little bit of a misnomer. I mean, the way that I would see it is that ship owners are essentially we were essentially short heavy fuel oil. That's our story. And most of us have said that that was something that we never bought with any term length on it, because we were always prepared to say that we thought that in the economics of shipping, we could pass on the daily operating costs to the buyer, to the person that paid the freight. Now, the IMO 2020 has switched us from being short heavy fuel oil to being short compliant fuel. So all of a sudden, we have an immediate boost. So the issue is, who's going to pay for it? So the first reaction of the ship owners was do nothing. Let's find out who's going to pay for this. When we get close enough to the implementation date, the assumption is that freight levels will go up now because the bulk of ships will be burning compliant fuel. Therefore, this will be a pass-through cost. So at that point, it looks like you've managed to switch the point of payment into freight. So what scrubbers are offering is a one-time premium to switch back into non-compliant fuels. Okay, so you pay an upfront lump sum. It would be buying or paying a premium for a cap on the oil price. So you basically switch yourself back down into a lower grade of fuel so that you can make money. But how long you can make money for to get back the premium and how big that premium will be, you don't know. So the risk is shifted to you on the basis of your upfront payment. But the upfront payment gives you no leverage. Actually, it gives you decreased leverage. Because when has you ever been able to get a cheap product on the basis that you upfront paid to be able to use it? So the balance of power around the payment for HFO has been shifted dramatically.
Christian, how do you see that? How do you see that fitting in the way you're looking at the price of different solutions to the equilibrium?
I mean, I do think that at a high level, yes, a scrubber is an option. You'll use it if it's profitable. But more broadly, if demand for compliant fuel is going to go up, then its price relative to heavy fuel oil will also go up. And that spread will widen, so that will then encourage the refiners to do some of the changes that I was talking about a little while ago, and then things will sort of converge back to some extent. So I would imagine that, yes, maybe in 2023, there will be very few ships left that will want to put scrubbers anymore because you did the most profitable ones at first, and then you move on to the largish, and when you get to the medium-sized ships, by that time the difference in fuel prices will have shrunk a bit, and so that trend will be over. But I do think, from a refiner's perspective, you're being asked to change the products you're giving. You need an incentive. That incentive has got to be, versus current levels, higher price for compliant fuel, lower price for heavy sulfur fuel.
Aaron, let me take a little different tack on this. So many times in these discussions in 2020, we talk about the fuel quality and compatibility issues on the compliant fuels, but there's been quite little discussion on operational issues and maintenance requirements for scrubbers. How maintenance intensive is the scrubber operation?
Well, the majority of it, it depends on which type you have, whether it's the open loop, the closed loop, or the hybrid, because depending on which one you're operating, there's significantly higher costs associated with maintaining. The lowest or the easiest to maintain would be the open loop, where you basically have your feed pumps and then you would be maintaining the control systems. But then when you get into the closed loop systems, then you have to deal with all of the treatment chemicals and the way of dealing with the sludges and things like that. So it gets more significantly harder to maintain, but it's not impossible.
And how about like if you go to ports where you don't get heavy fuel oil and you start burning compliant fuel and don't use the scrubber, is it easy to then get the scrubber going again?
Yes, from that perspective, you could switch between quite readily, and it wouldn't have too much of an impact on the operation. But I think it goes back to some of the other discussions we had a few minutes ago about how you're recording it, when you're using it, when you're not using it, and what the impact is. So it's really going to be more probably paperwork intensive at that point, but not really complicated for the owner to switch between the compliant fuels and the heavy fuels.
If I just could add some experiences from some of our members, because we are discussing that from time to time, and the most important problem, I think, what they all reported during the past are the sensors, where you have a big change also from manufacturers of these sensors, what we have seen, and that's exactly the critical point, as you have mentioned, because the sensor is linked to the monitoring software, and there we could see increasing number of port state controls, especially in the Baltic Sea ports in Germany, where you have to go for the latest changes of the scrubber guidelines of the IMO, that you are allowed also to be still compliant if you announce that there is a certain problem or defect on the software and the monitoring, and I think this is quite important also for the future. Just to add, because we had that point earlier, open loop, hybrid and so on, we just discussed it recently. We are getting more and more requests and inputs from those owners that there are increasing number of restrictions for open loop, at least in the ports. What we could see in the moment already of a list, we have put up what we are now building up with the European Shipowners Association and ICS to come up with a comprehensive worldwide list of ports for open loop restrictions. It is an increasing number, at least in Northern Europe. If you look on Norway, Sweden, Germany and other places, we know about HELCOM ideas to prohibit in total the use of open loop scrubbers in the Baltic Sea. For sure, this is only a small part of the world, but we have the restriction, as we discussed earlier, in all the US ports. And we have to monitor this as well, and for sure you could be compliant in the port by just using MGO, that's it. But most of the owners what we have spoken with, they are really looking forward to have at the end of one fuel ship, which would be the best alternative for a long-term discussion.
So, Paddy, have you seen a clear preference or from charterers to go one way or the other, or are they equally wondering what the right solution is as
I
the
think
owners?
my impression is that the only thing that I've noticed is more from the refiners and the charterers is they're rubbing their hands with excitement at the prospects because this is going to drive refining margins, and they're looking at this as a sort of golden age of, maybe not a golden age, but a silver age of refining. So I think that they're pretty excited about the supply side. And I think it's quite interesting, just from the comment we heard, that one of the German owners is negotiating a contract directly with a refiner for supply of HFO. That's quite interesting, because that means already you're changing the market structure. So, I mean, I wonder where the bunker supplier is going to be in this, if the owners are going directly to refiners for streams of fuel, because it could well be that the market changes quite dramatically.
Yeah, and I think maybe because of that, this regulation 2020 is probably the most significant regulation changing the industry since the double hull tankers. Would you agree? With the difference is that with the double hull tankers, the phase-in period was quite long.
Yeah.
Whereas this is almost an overnight event.
And it hasn't been sort of feathered in, has it? It's just been given a drop dead date, so that people aren't certain about when they have to act and react to it. I think as far as what we've noticed in the chartering market, and again, probably the German ship owners know better because of the extent to which time charter is important to the container business. But in the oil business, it's been a bit odd, because there has been some interest for ships with scrubbers, and as usual, it's not very attractive, in the sense that what we're being offered is charters where you could see a payback within 3 years, but normally they're just stopping short, so that they're giving you about 70% of the investment repaid over the fixed term of the charter, and then taking options beyond that. So it really is a very strong asymmetry as far as they're concerned. Upfront cost from you, guaranteed income, but they're not fully amortizing the investment, and then leaving themselves with the option to extend if, as they see it, this spread is still going to exist in terms of there really being HFO around and it really being available and useful to them. And we noticed that a much longer term charter taken by one of them who wanted a ship for 10 years specifically said no scrubber. So it's a very, very interesting mixed signal.
Right. So let's talk a little bit about LNG as an alternative. We had in the Christian slide, the sliver for the LNG as a fuel was quite small, even going forward. Aaron, what is your view? You build dual fuel engines. Do you see that there would be a more significant pickup on LNG as a fuel as a result of 2020 or as a result of other regulatory events?
Sure. Yeah. Sorry, the approach that we've taken is that we have technologies available for whatever choices the owners have. So that's really been our stand as a company. But when we look at LNG as a fuel, we continue to have the ongoing debate of the chicken and the egg. So in other words, how do you get the LNG to where the ships are? How does the bunkering process work? How is it distributed? Because today there's still limitations on where a lot of the ship owners can get the fuel. So what we have found is that when you're in areas where you have point-to-point, where you can have a fixed load or you can have stocks for those, then we're seeing more adaptation, especially when it comes to the ferries, some of the operators in the Baltics, some of the operators in the Americas. But what we're finding is that some of the choices for LNG, like the ones that were made for the deep sea by CMA CGM, that was a big step forward because now there's going to have to be infrastructure that's put together to support those vessels over a longer stretch than some of these point-to-point shorter runs. So I think as more investment is being made in the LNG infrastructure, then we would see more adaptation for new builds to go towards the use of LNG. But maybe not as much. There would be some retrofitting, but that would really be, again, the spread between the distillates and the gas available.
Kristen.
Yeah, I just want to make 2 points. I think in terms of the bunker fuel availability, I don't think that's necessarily going to be a big problem. There's going to be availability in Japan. In China is pushing LNG for their domestic freight. Singapore wants to be an LNG hub, and then there's availability here in Europe. So I think LNG is a fantastic fuel for coastal and inland markets because it is the cleanest fuel of all fossil fuels. Our point is, for the bigger ships that account for a big share of fuel oil consumption today, how many of them will really go for new builds powered on LNG? And that's where we see the market opportunity being smaller.
Okay. Wolfgang.
I think if I watch, we're following this discussion since years already for the German ship owners because we have a lot of feeder vessels in the Baltic Sea. We have all operating only in ICAs. And there's, I think, they are in the first round the most interesting customers for retrofitting on new builds. And if you look on the latest developments on the cruise vessel market, with I think now 15 or more new builds on cruise vessels being just built on mostly LNG, but a bit MGO as well, dual fuel, and CMA, CGM, to name it. And we are seeing an incredible improvement, especially here in Northern Europe, by LNG being supplied by bunker vessels from Rotterdam or some other places in the Baltic Sea area or the North Sea area. And we have this European Sustainable Shipping program, which is very much promoting the use of LNG. And as I said earlier, we now have in place the subsidy program with 17 ship projects being announced very soon, eventually next week or so, being subsidized by the German government for retrofit or new build costs, where we could get 40 to 60% of the additional costs for the LNG installation. And this is really a model what we have calculated quite several times now with some feeder operators here in Germany, which have a long-term charter, for example, with some of the big liners, to calculate the payoff costs for an LNG retrofit with the subsidy compared with the scrubber retrofit. And there I can only say the LNG with the subsidy program for sure is absolutely competitive. And the fuel costs in Rotterdam, I think we are just below HFO price compared on the MMBTU on the burning level, which is additional incredible. So I think also in long term, what we always say from our association, I think we have, in the moment, we have the next generation looking up to 2050. This will all be mainly fossil fuels, but then we have to bear in mind the big challenge of CO2 reduction by 50%, and there we have to look for alternative fuels, and there our major driver will be the synthetic LNG made out of wind power and CO2 altogether, methanol. There will be some subsidy programs in Germany coming up as well. So I think this also has to put into the whole view of new fuels for the future.
So I'm going to switch now to the audience for Q&A. I will give an opportunity to each one of you to do a closing statement in the end, but I'd like to see if there are any questions from the audience. Yes.
Just to pick up from where Wolfgang left it, there's a growing concern in the market that LNG will be a transitional fuel. You mentioned the 2050, and 2050 is a specific deadline. Fuel oil has been a transitional fuel for 150 years. That's enough years to make a lot of money for all the stakeholders concerned. Now, if LNG is a transitional fuel for, let's say, less than 30 years, why on earth the industry is, talking about it? And I would like to point forward the discussion now, and I would like to ask specifically, is the panel sharing the concern that LNG may be a transitional fuel? And if it's not a transitional fuel, and if you think that's maybe the point, what would be this, let's say, fuel that would lead the industry to be compliant for the 2050 challenge? So
may I ask each one of you to introduce yourselves? Just
my name is Apostolos Belokas. I'm from Safety for Sea.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Lars?
Robert. Thank you very much for that question, and it's actually was exactly the comments I was trying to make just before we were cut off by Kirsi here. It's really, the whole question of whether LNG is a bridging technology in our industry. It might be have some bridging perspectives in other industries, but the question here is really, does it bridge our industry to anywhere? And that's could potentially be questionable if this bridge really points to something in the other end. You could say from a bunkering perspective, maybe if you make your LNG bunkering hydrogen ready, you could say then there is a kind of a bridge. But the ships, on the other hand, they tend to have a lifetime of, say, 20, 25 years. So the ships today with LNG might not really be important for reaching the goal by 2050, because they will not be around by then. We have to make sure that the ships that we build, which will stay beyond 2050, that they are actually contributing adequately to reach that target. And that's one of our concerns. So as you say, it's one of these technologies where the benefits might not be so readily available, other than, of course, it's a very clean fuel to burn compared to oil. So from a local health perspective, a local air quality perspective, it's certainly a very nice fuel. We don't dispute that at all.
Tobias?
Tobias König, Lexing Maritime. I have two questions. One for Paddy Rodgers. What are you doing on your fleet? From hearing you talking, I would assume very few scrubbers. Is that correct?
Well, actually, we're doing a lot of review, and I'm afraid we can't really. I'd like to say that we're sceptical and full of uncertainty, but not indecisive. I think that the point is that we're reviewing quite closely different forms of compliant fuel and its supply and volume. Our technical teams are looking at scrubbers. My problem with the scrubber argument is that I've got a funny feeling that one way or another, ship owners are just going to pay more for fuel. And my anxiety about it is that, of course, that we shouldn't make it worse. If you look at Maersk and Søren Skou's position on that, I found it quite interesting. I happen to think, by the way, that I've never seen a worse piece of legislation. It's absolutely awful in terms of the speed with which it was brought in and the drop-dead deadline. It's as if they wanted to exacerbate the problem. And particularly this idea that we absolutely had to all act together to insist on compliant fuel to ensure that we can pass the cost on to the customer. Shipping companies are not wealthy. They're undercapitalized. They've lost a lot of money. There's no capacity to absorb $10,000 a day of operating costs. This would be completely fictional to think there's any absorption capacity within the shipping community for the increased operating costs. This has to be passed on to the consumer. So we all have to toe the line and do it, because if we don't, if the whole shipping industry went to scrubbers, do you know what would have happened? The economics of freight would be exactly the same, but you would have spent $5 million on a scrubber. That would be the end of the story. Oh, great. So this is not a small amount of money. This is, for a VLCC owner, you're already talking about 8 to 9% of his initial capital cost having to be respent so he can have business as usual. So, and for a technology which doesn't look right, doesn't feel right. So that's the sort of frustrating point of view. Okay, but then if the whole herd goes for compliant fuel, a few can exceptionally escape to use alternative abatement technology and can make a windfall profit. But that's even a bit questionable. It's a premium up front, and then you better hope that there's enough earning availability of the fuel and there are enough non-issues with your scrubber and your repair cost and no risks and no accidents, then eventually you'll get to the holy land of breaking even, because everybody I know talks about the break-even date. They don't have a holistic view that goes beyond that and says, this is going to improve my returns over 5 years. And the oil industry is saying, look, this should equalize itself out, and actually we'll want to take sulfur out as well, and this fuel won't really be available after 2023. That's 4 years, so you could make a lot of money, but this is no long-term planning for somebody who is asked to invest on a 20-year basis. So it's very, very frustrating. It doesn't feel right, but you can't give up competitive advantage. And if we don't pass through the cost to the customer, then all I can say is that we'll be spending more money and getting nothing for it.
So the average age of your fleet is 7 years?
Well, actually, for our Vs now, it's much younger. So the one thing we did already do was, by acquiring Generate with a much younger fleet, we dropped our unit consumption of fuel per day across our whole fleet dramatically. So I think our average age of our Vs now is about 4 years, and then we have an older Suezmax fleet. But so I think on average about 7 would be right across the fleet.
So, I mean, looking at all major requirements, we're looking actually at 15-year maximum trading age, maybe something like 16, 17 in isolated cases. So that means your scrubber investment really is a retrofit. You spend 10% of the money for the original ship at a time when the ship is already 4 or 5 years old, and you have a possible amortization period of maximum 10 years. That makes it an awful difficult decision.
Yeah, and if, as I say, I meant to go on about Søren Skou and Maersk, because his palpable uncertainty was that he knew that with 700 ships on the fleet list, anyway, he's not going to put scrubbers on them all. Can't be done.
No.
And if he said, okay, over a 5-year program, I'll do 150 a year until I've done the whole fleet. Even so, he's got a lot of oil majors telling him that by the time he gets to the last set of ships, there won't be any of this fuel available anyway. And in the meantime, they would have handed over the cost advantage to the customer because they would have signalled that the right price for freight was the HFO price, not the compliant fuel price. So already you're in a complete hiding to nothing in terms of where you go with the value proposition. So I mean that's the fundamental economic problem with it, and why I say it's a bad piece of legislation. Because where they should have started with is who's going to pay for this, not what are we going to do.
Anybody else have a question?
Kirsi, if I may,
Yes,
a
please.
little comment here, and I think Paddy, you're very right when we talk about what is the message we get from the oil majors. But I think when we talk refining industry, we have to realize that oil majors are not dealing with the entirety of the refining industry. There are loads and loads of independent refiners out there, or state-owned refineries who have a completely different perspective on what the purpose of their business is. I mean, a lot of the state-owns, they serve the inland, whereas whatever they skip out the back door to the marine industry is not even a part of their product mix. So, I mean, the experts we consult with Hintzsche Energy, they tell us we have to be a little bit more open to the fact that the refining industry is very, very fragmented, and they have very, very different perspectives of what good business is in this context. And we need the low sulfur products. At least that's what we saw from both the studies that were presented at IMO in 16. We need the low sulfur streams from all of them to make this equalize.
So what do you mean by? I mean the refineries. The refineries, certainly the ones that I know, and again, independent refineries, but probably in the West rather than in the Far East. But they just run a slate. They know exactly what the refinery's capabilities are, and they know the cost of all the feedstocks, of all the different crude oils around the world, and the freight cost to get them into their refinery, and they know what products they can produce, and exactly what price they have to sell them at. They pretty much all use a similar piece of software to do it. And they can just run what they think the expectation of the sale price is, what the feedstock price is, and what optimizations they can make with the equipment that they have to make this work. So one of the problems that they have is that, one of the great achievements that they have, by the way, is that the 4 million barrels a day of crude oil being sold to the marine industry is being sold today at the equivalent, more or less, of about $60 a barrel. So they're buying in the 70s, but they're selling the worst bit of the barrel in the 60s. This is absolutely critical to them. Don't imagine that this is a business which survives only on the price of diesel and the price of petroleum. If they don't get $60 a barrel for the heavy sulfurous fuel they sell to us, they will have to squeeze the differential, the lost value, out of petrol and out of diesel. Christian, help me on this. It's right.
Absolutely. Yeah, the refinery is not going to be worse off.
So they've got to push. So this is actually not a ship. This is going to be felt by everybody. So don't imagine that this is not going to affect the cost of filling your car up.
Mark.
Hello? Yeah, Mark Cameron from Ardmore Shipping. Aaron, maybe a question for you, but a lot of what we've been talking about here is the value of a retrofit in the scrubber. What about Tier 3 engines and fitting SOx scrubbers on those? Do you limit your options with regards to NOx? What are the engine manufacturers saying, and what guarantees are you putting out there that you can, in fact, have a Tier 3 engine and a SOx scrubber together? And who's going to be the guinea pig?
What was the last part?
Who's going to be the guinea pig?
That was a good question. Yeah, there's still a lot of, I guess, review that needs to be done on that, and I think, again, the challenge is really all of these things coming together at once, and how you address them. Each one of them shouldn't just be done individually, but more holistically. So I think the engine manufacturers need to to look at it in totality, but also working with some of the things that we also have in the pipeline for the future. I mean, there's other technologies we're also looking at that could help us address some of those things.
But I think what we're saying then is that there's a big complexity here that a lot of the industry is only looking at the here and now and not really looking at the order book. And when we say that all the new builds coming out with scrubbers, they're effectively tier 2 engines. They're not tier 3, is that correct?
That's correct.
I know.
Yes.
But we shouldn't rule out, there's only one area basically still in the world where you need to operate in tier 3 mode, and that is in the US ECA, where you cannot operate on 0.5% anyway. So depending on your scrubber installation, you might actually look at the option of not operating your scrubber in the ECA when you operate your tier 3 mode. So I mean, it's like you switch them.
So we are getting close to the end of this session, and we do have a reception afterwards for those of you who are able to stay and continue this discussion. But I would like to first of all give the panelists an opportunity to say whatever they want to say, or to answer, have we learned anything? Is there anything we could take from this to our regulatory process for 2035 and 2050? Are there anything that we can take away and do things better? Please, Wolfgang, why don't you start?
Yeah, coming back to the title of this interesting event, it's mainly 2020. It's one of the, as you mentioned earlier, the biggest challenge for the ship owners, what's coming up now, what we are facing, and we have to look into this very much in detail, but I think I'm fully convinced, as we have always said with all the shipping associations at the IMO and elsewhere, that the shipping industry will do their utmost to be compliant. How big the challenge will be at the end and the costs, we can only think about that. We have the additional challenge, as Lars Robert has pointed out rightly, of the carriage ban, which also has to be solved, where to get in of the remainings of heavy fuel oils and so on, and all the technical matters behind. And what I've found really interesting, and it underlines also our experiences, how difficult this decision is about scrubber, LNG, or which type of fuel we want to go for the future. And as I mentioned earlier, especially in Germany, we have this problem with the chartered tonnage and fleet, and we have to always look for a deal between the charterer and the owner, because the owner pays for the investment costs of a retrofit, but the charterer has the earnings of the lower fuel prices. And if you don't get to a deal on a long-term charter rate, which is a bit higher and pays off the investment costs, then there's no deal and there's no investment.
Robert, lessons learned?
Well, I don't think we have learned any lessons yet. I think we're about to learn lessons, and we have tons of questions and very few answers still, but with a lot of guesswork and a lot of clever guesswork, I would say. I mean, it's not all like wild guesses. It seems to be clear that oil price will go up, at least the oil price that we're exposed to in this industry. But also we heard from Goldman Sachs that it's like to have repercussions much beyond this industry, and the price at the pump is likely to be affected in the world, especially in the areas where fuel taxation is not very, significant. And that in itself, with the year 2020 in mind, pose some interesting questions, which we, of course, cannot answer now. The other part that is a very significant one is the whole business of transitioning from where we are now to this new, new world of low sulfur fuels. We can all understand where we are now. We can all understand if we are, way beyond this phase, but how do we actually make the transition in an orderly fashion without too much damage in the industry? There are definitely some contractual issues in relation to chartering that needs to be fixed. We're looking at that in Bimco at the moment to come up with a proper set of clauses that can kind of guide the owners and charterers and who is actually supposed to pay for what. Because there are huge open questions in this as well.
Thank you. Aaron, manufacturer's viewpoint.
Yeah, thank you very much again for the opportunity to be here. I think one of the most important things that we find every day is that as we have our dialogues with each of the owners, or even with the yards that are working with the owners and operators, it really has a lot to do with the operational profile of the vessels. It has to do with the operating zones that they're going in. So the way that we look at it is that there's not just a one-size-fit-all. I know we've talked a few times already about scrubbing technology and the different ones that are available, but we feel that there's opportunities in 2020 with different fuel types and with different technologies, but it really has a lot to do, again, with where you're operating, the age of your vessels, the age of your fleets, and how quickly you can get the payback. And I know we've been able to work with many owners already for new builds to prepare for those vessels coming out, but we're also seeing now the increase on the retrofits. So it's an interesting time, and it's keeping us on our toes. We're constantly looking for ways to work better and more efficiently with each of the owners that we're working with. So I think time will tell how long this, I guess, uncertainty lasts, but now that we're getting closer to the deadline, I know at least people are able to make better calculations, which is hopefully helping them make good decisions for the future.
Paddy, is there gold in them Thor Hills?
Well, that's, beware of people who are convinced. The most noticeable thing I would say is that if we had had this conversation in December last year, we would have talked about there being 2 or 3 scrubber manufacturers, and people were giving presentations about counting in hundreds how many scrubbers would be on board a ship, and the spread between MGO and heavy bunker fuel for 2020 onwards, initially for 2020 anyway, was $400 approximately a ton. So here we are. There are now probably 30 scrubber manufacturers, estimated at 5,000 or 6,000 ships will have scrubbers. Over 1 million tons of HFO going to be consumed a day, and already the fuel oil spread has come in $90. So already the profitability of making the decision has changed $90, and we're still a year and a half out. So, I mean, all I would say is A equals B. It's dynamic. It will stay dynamic. The more that scrubbers are bought, and the more that people put scrubbers on board, the less value they are, and the more value is returned to the market. So it's dynamic, it's difficult to decide, and anybody who's struggling with it is probably halfway sensible, and anyone who's convinced probably is marginally insane.
Christian, words of wisdom to this industry.
I was going to say I'm dead sure what the future looks like, but I think I'm going to revisit that. But I mean, to take on what Paddy said, I think it shows the optimal equilibrium, or the rational equilibrium, was not 100 scrubbers. It may be somewhere north of 5,000 scrubbers eventually, and at one point the incentive, because of the way the spreads are moving, the incentive disappears. So I think we will get there. The one thing I will say is, it is unfortunate that the shipping industry had a short period of time to come up to speed with the technology that it didn't have a lot of experience with, and the decision period was shortened even further because some of the details around compliance are only being sorted out, this late into the day. And I think that's going to lead to higher costs than otherwise. And I think that is always something you try to avoid as a regulator or policymaker.
Thank you all. Thank you so much for participating, and thank you for your listening and your attention. I hope you can stay and carry on the conversation. The receptionist is just outside. Thank you.